June 4th, 1942, began like the continuation of a dream that had lasted half a year. The sea was calm, the horizon looked empty, and the men around me moved with the quiet confidence of sailors who had stopped believing they could lose. I stood on the flight deck of the carrier Akagi before sunrise and watched the deck crews work as if they were part of a single machine. Each gesture practiced, each signal understood without hesitation. The smell was the first thing that always returned to me decades later, a mix of salt air, warm oil, and aviation fuel that clung to the back of the throat and made every breath feel like it mattered. For months, our fleet had been a moving center of gravity. Pearl Harbor had proven that the old order could be broken in one morning. Then came the long sequence of victories that followed like waves, each one reinforcing the belief that we were the sharp edge of the empire, the finest aviators afloat, the most disciplined deck crews in the world. On the Akagi, we repeated those ideas so often that they became instinct, the kind of instinct that settles into the body and changes posture and tone. You did not just think you were better, you walked like it. You spoke like it. You judged every report through that lens and did not even notice you were doing it. Midway was supposed to be another step in that same rhythm. A small atoll in the middle of the Pacific, important enough to draw the Americans out, isolated enough to be crushed quickly. The plan was large, complex, and spread across enormous distances of water, but at the deck level, you did not feel complexity. You felt routine. Planes were moved, armed, fueled, rolled forward, chocked, and launched. Men shouted into the wind and pointed, and the engines answered them with vibration that traveled straight through boots into bone. Before dawn, 108 aircraft lifted off toward the island in a single coordinated effort. From where I stood, the launch looked like a clean procession into the sky, each aircraft taking its place in a pattern that promised control. The flight deck became briefly quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned, like a craftsman stepping back from a piece of work that is going exactly as intended. There was relief in that quiet, and pride too, because the launch itself was proof of professionalism. On our carriers, the act of launching a strike was more than logistics. It was a ritual that told us who we were. Even then, there were small signs that should have unsettled me. The sky had a certain clarity. The air felt too open. The distant horizon looked like it could carry sound. Those are the kinds of details a man notices only when he is looking back, trying to find the first crack in the wall. In the moment, I told myself the weather was a gift. Clear conditions meant clean operations. It meant we could move faster and see better. It meant our pilots would return to us without difficulty. When the first American planes came from Midway, they arrived in fragments like desperate gestures thrown against a fortress. They came in low and scattered, and our fighters met them with the hard efficiency of men who had done this before. I watched the defensive fire and the turns of our fighters and felt the old certainty strengthen. The attacks were brave, but they did not look dangerous. The ocean swallowed the broken trails and falling shapes, and the deck crews around me returned to their tasks with the same calm. No one celebrated. Celebrating was unnecessary. This was simply the world behaving as it should. Then, as the morning advanced, something shifted, not dramatically, but in the way a room changes when an unseen door opens. A message came back from the strike leader over Midway stating that there was a need for a second attack. The words themselves were simple, almost routine, but the implication began to tighten the atmosphere on the carrier. A second attack meant time. Time meant exposure. Time meant more chances for the Americans to appear from the direction we kept pretending was empty. The orders from higher command had been clear. The reserve aircraft were to remain ready for enemy ships, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. That reserve was our real blade the strike meant for the American fleet, if it came. But the ocean, for hours, had offered nothing but silence. Scout reports were late or incomplete, and the emptiness of the horizon began to act like a sedative. When men cannot see a threat, their minds begin to treat it as less real. The decision was made to rearm the reserve aircraft for a second strike on the island. On paper, it was logical. You remove the known threat first. You secure the objective. You do not wait for a hypothetical enemy while your first mission remains unfinished. That kind of logic is seductive because it looks like discipline. It looks like carefulness. It looks like command. Below decks, the hangar became a different world, a world of controlled strain. Torpedoes were heavy and awkward, and swapping weapons was not a clean, quick exchange. It was sweat and metal and men guiding carts through tight spaces, keeping distance from propellers and fuel lines, making sure nothing dropped, nothing sparked, nothing rolled free. Aircraft were crowded close together because space was always limited. Every time a bomb trolley moved past a row of wings, there was a sense of threading a needle with explosives. Up on the flight deck, the carrier continued to feel like itself, but underneath, the ship was becoming a warehouse of risk. There is a particular tension that forms when a place is filled with fuel and munitions, and the people inside it are doing their best to pretend it is normal. They do not speak fear aloud. They shorten movements. They double-check straps. They avoid stepping where they do not need to step. They do not become dramatic. They become careful. Then came the kind of information that turns a plan into a trap after it has already closed around you. A scout reported sighting enemy ships. The first report did not include a carrier, and for a brief moment, the deck felt a small release, as if the American presence might still be manageable. But the next report indicated that there was what appeared to be an aircraft carrier among them. That was the moment the air on Akagi changed. It was not a shout, not panic, not sudden chaos. It was a tightening in posture, a sharpness in movement, a certain look passing between officers that said the day had become dangerous. The problem was that once you begin to rearm, reversing the process does not restore order. It compounds confusion. Torpedoes that had been moved away had to be moved back. Bombs already staged could not simply disappear. Aircraft already repositioned had to be shuffled again. In a modern sense, it was like trying to change the entire layout of a factory while the conveyor belts keep running. The hangar did not become disorderly, but it became busy in the most dangerous way, with too many tasks happening at once and too many objects that could not be allowed to touch. At the same time, our first strike was returning, low on fuel, needing to land. Recovery operations demanded the flight deck. Launch operations demanded the flight deck. A carrier cannot do both at the same time. That simple truth, so obvious in training, becomes merciless in combat because it forces you to choose a sequence, and sequence costs time. So the ship turned into the wind to recover planes. That movement felt routine, but it was also a commitment. The flight deck filled with returning aircraft, and the deck crews moved with speed and precision, guiding them in, chalking wheels, folding wings, clearing paths. In my memory, that part of the morning is almost painfully vivid because it is so ordinary. The most important day of many men's lives was filled with tasks they had done 100 times. They did them well, they did them fast, and none of it protected them from what was coming. The American torpedo squadrons arrived low over the water. They came in slow, exposed, like men volunteering to die. From the carrier, it looked like an act of desperation, the kind of attack that could not possibly succeed against fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Our fighters dropped down to meet them because that is what fighters do. They chased the threat they could see. They hunted what was in front of them. They fought at the altitude where the enemy existed. I watched them go down, and I remember thinking, with a cold professionalism that still embarrasses me, that the Americans were wasting their aircraft. The torpedo bombers were cut apart. Many fell into the sea before they could even line up. Their torpedoes did not strike our hulls. The water remained unbroken by explosions, and for a moment it seemed the worst had passed again. We had endured another wave. We had held, but the sky above us had been emptied in order to win that small victory. The defensive fighters, drawn down to sea level, were no longer guarding the high-altitude approaches. Without radar, what you cannot see might as well not exist until it suddenly does. As the torpedo attacks faded, the ship began to prepare for what felt like the return of control. Aircraft in the hangar were being readied again. The deck was being cleared again. Engines were being started again. It was around 10:20 in the morning. The exact minute matters to me now because it marks the border between the world where I still believed in our invincibility and the world where I did not. On the Akagi, the launch procedure began to take shape. Pilots sat in cockpits. Deck officers watched the wind and the spacing. The carrier's motion steadied into the familiar pattern. Men around me looked forward, not up. It is strange how the body follows expectation. When you expect danger from the horizon, you stare at the horizon. When you expect safety above, you forget to look. Then a cry cut through the sound of engines, and the first thing I saw was not a plane, but a shadow moving fast, far above, where no one had been watching. It was as if the sun itself had released them. Dive bombers appeared out of the glare at high altitude, dropping their noses toward us with a speed that made them look unreal. For a fraction of a second, the mind tries to reject what the eyes are showing, because it does not fit the story you have been living inside. The next seconds were not like battle scenes people imagine. There was no time for speeches. There was no time for complicated thought. There was only motion and sound, and the sudden understanding that the ship beneath my feet was filled with fuel, ordnance, and aircraft, and that the enemy had arrived at the one moment when all of those things were gathered together. I saw the first bombs fall and felt the deck shudder under impacts that seemed to come from the sky itself. The sound was not a single explosion, but a sequence of concussions layered over each other. Metal striking metal, fire blooming, men moving with the kind of frantic purpose that has no room for words. Smoke began to climb, thick and dark, and the air changed from fuel and ocean to burning paint, burning rubber, burning flesh that no one ever admits to until it is already too late. My attention snapped to the places where aircraft were staged and where weapons had been moved. All the careful work in the hangar, all the controlled motion suddenly became the fuel of catastrophe. When bombs reach a space where planes are armed and fueled, the ship does not just burn, it multiplies fire. It turns every stored object into a second explosion waiting to happen. The first real fear that hit me was not fear of dying. It was fear of being trapped inside a machine that had become a furnace, and fear of failing the men who were below deck with no clear path out. I remember gripping the rail so hard that my fingers hurt, as if I could hold the carrier steady by force of will. The idea was absurd, but the body does absurd things when it realizes that willpower has become irrelevant. The last clear image I have from that opening moment is the flight deck, a place built for order, now filled with smoke and fragments and men running toward danger because they had been trained to treat the ship as something that could always be saved. I saw officers pointing, crews dragging equipment, sailors trying to move aircraft that were already doomed, and above it all, the dive bombers pulled out of their dives and vanished back into the brightness, leaving behind the sound of flames taking hold. Then the smoke thickened, and the ship began to feel like it was no longer a carrier, but a burning city at sea. And I understood with a clarity that still makes my stomach tighten that the story we had been living since Pearl Harbor had ended, and a new one had started, and it did not care about our confidence. It ended there. The bomb did not feel like a single event. It felt like a door opening. One moment I was still thinking like an officer on a carrier, counting tasks and routines, believing the damage was something men could organize against. The next moment, the Akagi became a living furnace, and the first truth of that morning settled into my bones. A flight deck can be repaired, but a hangar packed with fueled aircraft and exposed weapons cannot be argued with once fire reaches it. The air changed color. It went from blue and salt to a heavy black that clung to the throat. The smell was gasoline first, then burning paint, then something worse that the mind tries to rename as anything else. The initial explosion was loud, but what followed was louder in a different way. The ship began making a continuous sound, a deep roaring that never paused, because aviation fuel does not burn like wood. It burns like a decision that cannot be undone. A carrier is not one fire. It is many fires waiting to become one. Below the deck, we had been in the most dangerous state a carrier can be in. We had aircraft staged for a strike. We had munitions out of their safest places, and we had crews moving torpedoes and bombs through tight corridors because the morning had forced us to change our minds twice. That was not cowardice or incompetence. It was the trap Midway built for us. Rearming is slow. Reversing rearming is slower, and all of it happens in spaces designed for efficiency, not for mercy. The blast that followed the bomb was the sound of fuel igniting and weapons beginning to cook off. It was not one sharp crack. It was a rolling series of concussions that came from inside the ship, as if the Akagi had been hollowed out and the fire was now speaking through the steel. Men on the deck staggered like they had been struck, not because they were wounded, but because pressure can punch a body without leaving a mark. Eyes watered instantly. Skin tightened. Breathing became a conscious action. I saw sailors try to do what sailors always do. They pulled hoses. They ran toward the glow, because the only way a carrier survives is if men run toward the fire, for it becomes the whole ship. They were not heroes in a theatrical sense. They were professionals trapped in their own professionalism. Habit made them brave. Habit also made them slow to accept that the situation had already grown beyond human strength. Smoke poured up through openings like water finding a crack. It did not drift away. It stacked above us, building a ceiling that lowered the sky and made the deck feel smaller every second. Through that smoke, the world became a series of partial images. A man's hands on a hose that bucked like a living animal, boots sliding on wet steel, a helmet lost and rolling until it hit the base of the island structure, a stretcher carried too fast because there was no safe place to put what was on it. Then came the second shock, the one that turned my fear into something colder. It was not only us. Between shifts in smoke, I caught the silhouettes of our other carriers and saw columns rising from them too. The sea around the fleet was suddenly marked by black pillars, and I understood that what had happened overhead was not an unlucky hit on one ship. It was a perfect strike at the exact moment we were most vulnerable. The thought arrived with brutal clarity. The enemy did not stumble onto us. The enemy arrived when our decks were blocked with recovering aircraft, when our fighters were down low after the torpedo attacks, and when our hangars were crowded with fuel and weapons. We had been blind. We had been convinced the sky belonged to us. Without radar, we did not even know we were about to be killed until the scream of diving aircraft was already above our heads. The mind tries to protect itself by narrowing. I focused on details because the full picture was too large. I remember looking at the deck crew's faces. Soot made them look older, as if a decade had passed in minutes. Their eyes were open too wide. Some men had that empty look that comes before panic, the look of someone waiting for instructions that cannot exist. There were almost no words. Too much wind, too much noise, too much smoke. Commands became gestures, pointing, grabbing sleeves, shoving someone down when a secondary blast shook the deck. The ship spoke louder than any officer could. Metal rang. Somewhere below, something detonated, and the deck vibrated as if a giant hand had struck it from underneath. I went toward the island structure because it offered the only partial shelter from the wind and the drifting heat. The air there was still poison, but it was less open. Even that small choice felt like betrayal, as if stepping away from the center of the fire meant abandoning the men fighting it. But the officer in me needed to see, needed to understand what could still be controlled. And that is when the third shock arrived. I realized we were not fighting a fire. We were fighting a sequence. A carrier can survive one hit if the fire stays contained. But we had aircraft, fuel, and weapons arranged in the worst possible pattern. We had created the conditions of a chain reaction. The bomb did not need to destroy the ship's structure. It only needed to open the hangar to flame. After that, every fueled aircraft became a fuel tank. Every exposed bomb became a timed threat. Every minute turned into a gamble about what would cook off next. What made it terrifying was not only the heat, it was the feeling of inevitability. Men kept dragging hoses forward. Foam spilled across the deck. Water steamed on contact with hot metal. But the fire inside the ship did not care about courage. It fed from stored fuel and from the fact that so many aircraft had been prepared for a launch we would never make. The carrier that had once felt like a weapon now felt like a burning warehouse we could not empty. I looked out again and forced myself to accept what my eyes had avoided. Multiple carriers burning at once. The heart of our striking force was being ripped out in minutes, and the ocean was too wide to hide the smoke. In that moment, the pride of the previous months did not disappear gently. It snapped. It became a memory that no longer matched reality. I did not think, we are losing. I thought, we have already been defeated, and we are only now receiving the message. It ended there. The smoke thinned for a few seconds, and that brief clarity was worse than the darkness. From the edge of the island structure, I could finally see across the water, and the scale of what had happened slammed into me. Multiple columns of smoke were rising at once from the carriers that had been the center of our world only an hour earlier. The sea looked calm, almost indifferent, and that calm made the fire feel obscene, like a wound that refuses to match the beauty around it. On the Akagi, the battle became internal. There was no enemy in sight now, but the ship was still under attack from the inside, and every minute was a decision about what to save and what to abandon. I moved toward an opening that looked down into the ship because I needed to see with my own eyes whether the fire was spreading or trapped. Heat rolled up from below in visible waves. It was not the clean heat of an engine room. It was the wild heat of fuel and paint and rubber burning together. The air that rose out of that opening carried tiny black flakes that stuck to sweat and turned skin gritty. It was like breathing through a cloth dipped in oil. A sound came from below that I will never forget. It was the sound of ammunition cooking off, not one detonation, but an irregular snapping and hammering, as if someone were striking steel with a fist from the inside. Each snap was a reminder that the hangar was not a room anymore. It was a chamber full of objects that were choosing the moment they would become weapons. I saw a cart at the edge of the opening, half pulled away, its wheels melted into a shape that barely resembled wheels. I remember staring at it because it made the situation simple. Metal does not melt unless you have lost the fight for temperature. That was the first time I understood we were not dealing with a fire we could put out quickly. We were dealing with a fire that could outlast our bodies. Men came up from below with their heads low, faces smeared with soot, blinking hard because their eyes could not hold the smoke. One of them tried to speak to an officer near me, but the words were swallowed by wind and noise. He used his hands instead, shaking them as if he was trying to fling the heat off his skin. He pointed down, then pointed toward another hatch. That was enough. The lower spaces were becoming traps. We tried to keep routes open because on a ship, routes are life. But the ship was changing shape faster than we could learn it. A corridor that was passable became a chimney when a door failed. A ladder that had carried men for years became useless when smoke rolled up it like a tide. When you are fighting a fire at sea, time is not measured in minutes. It is measured in breaths. The flight deck above us still looked like a place where work could happen. Hoses, foam, men running with purpose. But every time the ship shuddered with another internal blast, that purpose flinched. Bodies react before pride does. Hands tighten on rails. Knees bend. Eyes search for the next shock. And then the men continue, because continuing is all they have left. I forced myself to walk the deck, not to supervise in a ceremonial way, but to keep my own mind from collapsing inward. I needed to see what the fire crews were doing, what the damage control parties were doing, how far the heat had spread. The deck was slick, water and foam mixed with spilled fuel in thin films that made boots slide. In some places, the metal was hot enough to turn that water into steam, and the steam rose in bursts that hid faces and made men look like ghosts passing through a white curtain. Near the edge of the deck, I looked down and saw a patch of ocean that was littered with debris. It was not dramatic from that distance. It was just fragments floating like evidence. That was another kind of shock. The battle was leaving pieces of us behind even while we were still alive. Inside, the ship kept making choices for us. There was a moment when someone opened a hatch too quickly and smoke poured out with force, not drifting, but pushing, as if it had weight. The man who opened it recoiled instantly, and two others grabbed him before he fell. That smoke was not just smoke. It was poison that had been trapped and heated and compressed. It was the product of compartments burning with no place to exhale. It carried the taste of fuel and something chemical that made the throat tighten and the lungs refuse cooperation. That was the instant I felt the fear change. Up to then, fear had been about bombs and aircraft and being hit again. Now fear was about suffocation, about losing direction, about stepping into a space that looks empty and finding out the air is lethal. It is a primitive fear, older than war. I began to count men without meaning to, not numbers, faces. I recognized some. Others were only shapes and smoke. A few were missing, and the mind does something cruel in those moments. It starts filling the missing spaces with guesses. A ladder jammed, a hatch blocked, a compartment sealed too late. You do not need confirmation to feel guilt. Your imagination supplies it. Then, through a gap in smoke, I saw another carrier's smoke column bending in the wind, and I remembered the morning again, the routine confidence, the feeling that the sky belonged to us. The contrast hit like a physical blow. The same sun, the same ocean, the same steel. Only the truth had changed. I understood something that felt like humiliation and clarity at the same time. We had been certain the Americans would appear where we expected them. We had treated the empty horizon as proof. We had treated our own momentum as armor, and while we were busy reorganizing our hangars and our weapons, the enemy had arrived at the one moment when our strength was stacked neatly in one place, fueled, armed, and waiting to explode. The ship trembled again. A deeper jolt this time, followed by a brief, terrifying silence, the kind of silence that suggests something has finally collapsed. Then the roar returned, louder, and the smoke thickened, and I knew the fire had found a new pocket to feed on. I did not think about the Empire. I did not think about history. I thought about the men still below deck, and the fact that every second we spent fighting for the ship might be stealing seconds from them. I turned away from the rail and moved back into the smoke, because the only thing worse than dying on a burning carrier is surviving while knowing you stopped moving. It ended there.